The courtroom was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made even breathing sound like an interruption. People shifted in their seats, but no one dared speak. The air was heavy with the smell of polished oak and something else, fear. All eyes were fixed on the man sitting high above them, the man with the silver hair, sharp jaw, and eyes like shards of ice. Judge Walter Garrison had been on the bench for 35 years, and in all that time, his expression had hardly changed. He didn't smile, didn't soften. If there was any warmth in him, it had been buried decades ago under layers of power and prejudice. Marcus Hill stood at the defendant's table, hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles blanched. 27 years old, broad-shouldered, a man who looked like life had forced him to grow up too fast. His brown eyes moved between the judge, the prosecutor, and the 12 jurors who couldn't even meet his days anymore. His suit, borrowed from his uncle, was neat but a size too small in the shoulders. He'd done everything his lawyer told him. No outbursts, speak clearly, yes sir, no ma'am, keep your tone even. And still, he knew what was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Garrison's voice cut through the silence like a crack of a whip. "You have heard the testimony, you've seen the evidence, and you are now instructed to render your verdict." Marcus's mother, Gloria, sat in the back row, clutching her worn Bible so hard the pages bent. Every so often her lips moved in silent prayer. She'd been here before. 18 years earlier, her husband, David, had stood in that very spot, accused of stealing construction tools from a job site. He swore he was innocent. They found him guilty. Judge Garrison had sentenced him to 20 years without blinking. David never made it home, stabbed in a prison yard 6 years into his sentence. Gloria buried him in a suit 2 sizes too big, the only one she could afford. The jury foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty." The word seemed to hang in the air, thick and poisonous. Gloria's hand shook so hard she nearly dropped the Bible. Marcus didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. The prosecutor smirked, as if he'd been certain of this outcome all along. Marcus's lawyer, a young public defender with too many cases and not enough time, put a hand on his client's shoulder. "We'll appeal," he whispered, though even he sounded like he didn't believe it. Judge Garrison leaned forward. "Mr. Hill, you have been found guilty of assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, and causing bodily harm." His tone was almost bored. "I see no reason for leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10. May God have mercy on your soul." Gloria's voice broke. "You did this to my husband, and now my son! God will judge you, Walter Garrison!" The bailiff moved toward her, but she didn't stop. "You think you're untouchable, but your day is coming." "Remove her from my courtroom," the judge ordered without raising his voice. As they pulled her toward the door, Marcus's eyes met hers. He gave her the smallest nod, an unspoken promise that this wasn't the end. What Judge Garrison didn't notice, or maybe didn't care to, was the man sitting 2 seats down from Gloria in the back row. Harold Mason, Gloria's brother, was there not just as family, but as a hunter watching his prey. Harold had been an investigative journalist for 20 years. He had exposed corrupt politicians, corporate fraud, even a sheriff who ran a human trafficking ring. But this was personal. Harold had been digging into Garrison for months, piecing together whispers and scraps. Recordings from a private golf club where the judge made jokes about keeping the streets clean of troublemakers. Transcripts of cases where white defendants walked free under charges far worse than Marcus's. Anonymous tips about jury manipulation. Every thread he pulled unraveled something uglier.
And today, seeing Marcus led away in handcuffs, Harold decided he wouldn't just write a story. He was going to end Walter Garrison's career, his legacy, and maybe even his freedom. The first leak came 2 nights later. A local news station aired a short clip, audio of Garrison laughing with a friend at a charity dinner. The voice, unmistakable, said, Juries will believe anything if the defendant's wearing a suit and isn't black. It blew up online. Social media boiled with outrage. Hashtags calling for Garrison's removal trended in the state. The judge, of course, called it fake news. But Harold wasn't done. That was just the first taste. He had a video, grainy but clear enough, taken by a cleaning staff member in the judge's chambers. Garrison was slouched in his leather chair, drink in hand, telling a visiting prosecutor, "It's simple math. Fewer of them on the street, less crime. I'm doing the city a favor." When Harold released that clip, the backlash was instant and deafening. Civil rights lawyers, activists, and even retired judges went on record demanding an investigation. The state's Judicial Review Board announced a formal inquiry. Gloria sat in her living room, watching the news every night with Harold by her side. For the first time in years, she let herself hope. But Harold wasn't celebrating yet. He knew men like Garrison didn't go down easy. What he didn't know was that Garrison was already making calls, leaning on old favors, trying to crush the inquiry before it got anywhere. The judge had survived scandals before, but this time, Harold had more than just words. He had proof, financial records tying Garrison to dismissed cases involving his political donors, evidence of under-the-table payments for case considerations, and a sworn statement from a former court clerk who had witnessed jury tampering. And then Harold decided to set the trap. He reached out to a contact at the state attorney's office, a young prosecutor named Dana Price. She'd been fresh out of law school when Garrison had humiliated her in court, calling her too emotional to handle serious cases. She hadn't forgotten. When Harold slid the folder across her desk, Dana's eyes widened. If half of this is real, he's finished. It's all real, and I've got more. By the time the judge realized how deep Harold's reach went, it was too late. The subpoena landed on Garrison's desk on a Thursday morning. By Friday, he was on paid suspension. On Monday, he was in a courtroom, not as the man with the gavel, but as the defendant. And sitting in the front row, right where she could see him squirm, was Gloria Hill, her Bible in her lap, and the faintest smile on her lips. The courthouse smelled different when Walter Garrison entered it without his robe. The leather of his chair had been replaced by the cold hardness of a defendant's bench. No gavel in his hand, just a pair of shaking fingers clasped together, the knuckles pale. The man who had once commanded silence now sat in it, his own name printed on the docket in bold black ink. State of Eastwood versus Walter Garrison. The irony was not lost on anyone in the packed room. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras already rolling. Protesters gathered outside, chanting loud enough to seep through the courthouse walls. A line of police officers kept the crowd at bay, but nothing could keep the tension from flooding the room. Prosecutor Dana Price stepped forward. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her voice carrying the weight of years she had waited for this. She remembered the day Garrison had smirked at her in open court, cutting her off mid-sentence with the words, "Let's have someone more seasoned handle the serious cases." Now she addressed the jury with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that the man before you, a man entrusted with the highest responsibility of our judicial system, used his power to discriminate, to manipulate, and to destroy lives based solely on the color of their skin. He betrayed his oath, and in doing so, he betrayed this community."
Garrison's defense attorney, a slick gray-haired man named Lowell Sharp, countered with polished confidence. "The prosecution will paint my client as a villain, but what you'll hear is nothing more than selective editing, misinterpretation, and politically motivated slander. Judge Garrison's record speaks for itself, decades of service to justice." The first witness was Harold Mason.
He walked to the stand with steady steps, the folder of evidence clutched in his hands. He wasn't there as a journalist, but as a brother. He told the jury about Marcus, about David, about how he'd started digging. Then came the recordings, played aloud in the courtroom, the words echoing like gunshots in the silence. Juries will believe anything if the defendant's wearing a suit and isn't black. It's simple math. Fewer of them on the street, less crime. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Even Sharp couldn't mask the discomfort on his face. Dana followed with bank records, campaign donations, and court documents showing patterns too deliberate to be coincidences. White defendants with violent charges walking away with probation, black defendants getting maximum terms for lesser crimes. But the most damning moment came when a former court clerk named Allison Burke took the stand. She described in detail how Garrison would request juror lists, circle names, and make calls to adjust the pool before trials began. "He told me once," she said, her voice trembling, "that he didn't want sympathetic ears in certain cases. I asked what he meant, and he said people who might relate to the accused's background." By the end of the second day, Garrison's shoulders had slumped. The man who had always sat taller than everyone else now looked small, cornered. Gloria came every day, sitting in the same seat. Sometimes she caught Garrison looking at her, but there was no recognition in his eyes, only the dull panic of a man watching his own empire crumble. Marcus was still behind bars while the appeal wound its way through the system, but Harold promised his nephew that freedom was coming. The trial lasted 8 days. On the final morning, the gallery was so full that security had to turn people away. Dana's closing argument was quiet, but razor sharp. This is not just about Walter Garrison. This is about every person who has ever faced a justice system tilted against them. We're here to say no more. When the jury filed back in, you could hear a pin drop. The forewoman's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." Gloria didn't move, didn't breathe, until she heard the words, "sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." And then slowly, she closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding for nearly 2 decades. As the bailiffs moved to cuff him, Garrison's eyes darted around the courtroom. No one came to his defense. No old allies stepped forward. He was alone. The cameras caught the moment the cuffs clicked shut, a flash that would replay on news loops for weeks. Outside, the chants erupted. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for all!" 2 months later, Marcus walked out of prison a free man. His charges had been vacated, his record cleared. The state awarded him a settlement, but the real payment came the day he and Gloria stood outside the courthouse, the sun warm on their faces, and Harold said, "It's over." But for Garrison, it wasn't. In prison, the walls closed in faster than the years passed, and one afternoon, as he sat alone in the yard, he saw a familiar figure walk past, a tall man with broad shoulders and calm brown eyes. Marcus didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just kept walking, leaving the former judge to sit there with the weight of everything he had taken and everything he had lost. Justice had come full circle, and this time the last verdict wasn't his to give.